Good afternoon. My name is Jasmine Ramsey-Rizai, and I'm the Director of the Advocacy and Communications Department at YWCA Toronto. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion today on equal pay. We would like to begin this conversation by acknowledging that the land on which YWCA Toronto operates is Treaty 13 land. This land is the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations to share peacefully and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Many Indigenous communities continue living on this land and calling it their home today. The first peoples of this land signed treaties of peace and friendship in good faith and were in turn betrayed. We recognize the ongoing impact of colonialism and that we cannot successfully engage in any kind of equity work in our society without actively engaging in reconciliation efforts with Indigenous nations. So with that acknowledgement, I'll turn it over to Sarah Boesveld, the Manager of Advocacy, who will be moderating the panel today and has some housekeeping items to share with you before we begin.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. It's such a timely and relevant one, which we'll get to, but very quickly off the top, really wanted to go over some quick housekeeping. So we are recording the panel and we will be sharing it afterwards for the benefit of everyone who could attend and those who couldn't. We also have a Q&A and we would love for you to submit some of your questions, and we'll have an opportunity at the end, about 15 minutes, to even, you can put your hand up using the raise hand function and ask a question verbally. And what we'll do in that case is just identify you and ask you to unmute yourself, and you can ask your question, then you can mute yourself again while our panel goes about their answering of that question that you're asking. So we're also delighted to have our Chief Executive Officer of YWCA Toronto, Heather Mcgregor, with us today, and Heather's just going to share a few words with everyone. Heather?
So again, I am welcoming you as well. And thank you particularly to our panelists for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. At YWCA Toronto, we seek a radical transformation of society where all women, girls, and gender diverse people can thrive. Every year, we serve over 13,000 community members across Toronto, helping people find safety, gain meaningful employment, and access affordable, supportive housing. Building youth leadership and the voices of young women is also of critical importance to us. The subject of women at work is a resonant one for YWCA Toronto, not only because we provide employment and training services, because work is central to our lives. It is where a woman finds community, connection, and a sense of purpose. And if a woman does not have income security by way of a job, she is unlikely to find a safe, affordable place to live, let alone put food on the table. If she has experienced gender-based violence, work can often be a far safer place than home. As the pandemic has highlighted, if women do not have access to high quality, affordable childcare, they are more likely to forego paid work and provide that service in their families. I'm so looking forward to hearing this discussion today, and I'm very grateful to all who are attending and to the advocacy and communications team for organizing this panel. And now I'll turn it back over to our Manager of Advocacy, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Heather. It means a lot to have you here as well. Thank you as well, just for taking time out of your day. And I'm acknowledging too, and here in Ontario, it's April break. So a lot of people who have kids at home are really with kids at home, or if they're juggling things, that's such a reality too. And those across the country who may have joined us. So it's not lost on me that we're gathered in a third emergency ordered provincial shutdown, speaking today together. And we're facing really a terrible new pandemic on many levels. We have ICUs filling up with younger people on account of these deadly variants, and still no paid sick days, no proper vaccine prioritization for some of these essential workers. And I'm thinking too today, especially childcare workers. We have our kids at home, and the service sector jobs that so many women rely on as well, and retail are just not a thing right now. Still no credible plan to recoup the thousands of jobs women have lost throughout the past year, and women's economic security more generally is not getting the attention that it deserves and really critically needs right now. So it's also not lost on me that we have so many ongoing efforts to improve working conditions and opportunities for women. And this all far precedes the pandemic, of course. So Equal Pay Day, we just marked last Wednesday. That reminds us that gender equity in employment is an ongoing effort, and that there are many other systemic gender inequities on that front. And next week's federal budget on Monday is also supposed to be finally setting the course for national childcare, and we hope helping to build some sustainable models for women's economic recovery. So the purpose of this panel today is to help us contextualize all of this, and to look at the systemic and structural barriers, just chat out some of the ideas for a path forward. And so I can't have gathered a better team today to talk us through some of this. So I'm going to introduce our panel now. So Armine Yalnizyan, I'm just going to pin you there so everyone can see you, is the Atkinson Foundation's Fellow on the Future of Workers. She served as Senior Economic Policy Advisor for the Deputy Minister at Employment and Social Development Canada from 2018 to 2019. And is currently serving on Minister Freeland and Fortier's Task Force on Women in the Economy. And of course, I will be asking her about that. She helped lead the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Inequality Project from 2008 to 2017, and provided weekly business commentaries on CBC Radio, CBC TV from 2011 to 2018, although I'm still hearing her all the time now. I'm speaking on the media about this pandemic, of course. And she is the past president of the Canadian Association for Business Economics. Welcome, Armine. Oh, yes, I should ask you to unmute yourself too. That would help.
And thank you for inviting me to be part of this day.
Thank you. Fay, you're next. You could also unmute yourself as I tell everyone who you are and pin your profile. All right. So Fay Faraday is the founder of Faraday Law, a law firm based here in Toronto. She's a nationally recognized social justice lawyer, strategic advisor, policy consultant, and academic whose work focuses on constitutional law, human rights, and labor law. Fay has litigated many leading human rights and constitutional cases at the Supreme Court of Canada. She's been active in the community for 3 decades, supporting community organizing for migrant worker rights and intersectional feminist work on economic and racial justice. Fay is an assistant professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and the co-chair of the Equal Pay Coalition, on which YWCA Toronto serves. So welcome so much, Fay. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I'm so happy to be here with Armine and Robyn.
Awesome. Okay, and Robyn. Awesome. Hello, everyone. Hello, Robyn. Robyn Doolittle is a member of the Globe and Mail's investigative team and is a 2-time winner of Canada's Missioner Award and former Journalist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards. So since coming to the Globe in 2014, she's probed suspicious business contracts, political corruption, and Canada's response, of course, to the COVID-19 pandemic. Her latest investigation, The Power Gap, which we'll talk about today, has explored gender inequities in the modern workforce, and Robyn's Unfounded series, which revealed the ways that Canadian police services mishandle sexual assault cases, prompted a national overhaul of policy, training, and practices around sexual violence. She's also the author of 2 books, which she didn't include in her bio. Crazy Town, the Rob Ford story, and Had It Coming, What's Fair in the Age of Me Too. Welcome, Robyn.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm going to pin myself to baby's first panel moderation here. I'm just going to be real about that. We all have to just be real about our realities right now. I had already said this, but what a dream team to talk about these things. So, Armine, I'm going to pick on you first. Your analysis and your tagline for what's happened over this past year, the She Session, has obviously been used all over the place this past year. I was actually interested to note that you actually coined the term He Session back a decade ago. Is that not right?
No, I did coin the term She Session in March last year.
That's right.
But it was based on the New York Times portmanteau that was developed in 2009 in the wake of the global financial crisis. which called that recession a he session. Every recession's a he session until this one.
Which we'll talk about for sure. So you have been sort of speaking on this so much and obviously really in the trenches on these issues. Can you just help us contextualize what happened this past year, like this being the very first global she session? Can you give us a lay of the land on that?
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me to be part of this. I also want to say that I am talking to you from the banks of the Ottawa River, which is unceded Anishinaabe territory. And living here has made me realize how, and recent events have made me realize how we're all just passing through. And the number one thing we have to do for one another is care for one another, care for the planet, care for each other, make sure we don't leave things worse than when we arrived. And we are very much on the precipice of doing that. If the pandemic taught us anything, it is that the care economy is the foundation of the essential economy. And the non-essential economy, the stuff we don't really need, the nail and hair salons, the restaurants and the bars, the retail that isn't essential, the air travel. And as we found out last March, schools were apparently not essential. Either was childcare, who knew? But a year later, it turns out that care is absolutely critical to us being able to get about to do the work that Heather talked about. I don't want to fetishize paid work too much because the care economy is both paid and unpaid care. And in the paid sector, it includes incredibly well-paid, well-respected jobs in healthcare and in education, as well as really crap jobs. People that are primarily racialized and low paid and in precarious jobs, even though they are deemed to be essential to our well-being. So we have a lot to understand about the caring economy, but so many people think that the magic bullet to the problem that we're in, and the one that we have apparently needed all along, was a basic income. I couldn't underscore Heather's point more strongly than if we are talking about giving people handouts in terms of a basic income, we are going to miss the boat. We are on the precipice of a remarkable period where population aging, which was already creeping up on us before the pandemic, means that we could bring everybody that has been systemically marginalized in labor markets into the mainstream with better opportunities for training, better jobs, and we could make every job a good job, starting with the care economy, which is the driver of the economy. We often think about it as like some kind of, derivative process of GDP. Like if we do GDP right, somehow we get to do care right. Well, before the pandemic, it was over 12% of GDP, which wildly eclipses oil and gas and manufacturing, and is rivaled only by real estate, which is a sicko way to drive your economy. And when it comes to the number of jobs, there is no rival to the care economy. It accounts for over 1 in 5 jobs. But as I said before, not all jobs are good jobs. Mm-hmm. And so if we've got a job to do now, and moving forward is putting care at the foundation of the essential economy and making sure every job is a good job. We've got so far to go. You, Sarah, have done great work in talking about how the Royal Commission report on the status of women, which celebrated its 50th anniversary on December the 7th last year, has been asking for this for 50 years. But we do seem to be right on the precipice. In fact, Monday, we might be actually walking through the looking glass on how we could start that process of building a system of care, not just a market for babysitting. And I am very hopeful that that will be part of a changed conversation where we demand all of our elected representatives at every level of the economy to put care at the center of how they define the essential economy for the good of us all.
I mean, if there's any time to really bring that into focus, it's a pandemic as it happens, right? These are the foundational pieces that are keeping everything going. There's a reason why childcare is still open, right? Like people need it
right.
in order to work. And so we've talked about the job losses piece as well. And I wanted to just turn it over to Fay. Equal Pay Day last week. And a fun fact about Equal Pay Day, for those who don't know, it is calculated by nation according to how many extra days women would have to work. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fay, in order to get to the place of equity in pay for men. So here in Canada, that would be 3 months, and is it 4 months?
3.5
What
months.
time is a construct, and 7 days. That's a lot of extra time to have to work. And so I wanted to kind of place it in that time frame, and also have you help us understand from a pay equity perspective, just the difference that it has made for racialized women, for Black women, Indigenous women, and disabled women in Canada. What is that lay of the land, and what is the landscape for them and the realities now?
So Equal Pay Day, you're right, does mark on average how far into the new year women have to work to catch up to what men got by the end of last year. The date in April is an average, but of course the way that structural racism and sexism operate means that that burden isn't shared equally. So overall, women earn 32% less per year than men, but women with disabilities earn 56% less, so 44 cents on the dollar. Immigrant women earn 55% less, so that's 45 cents on the dollar. Indigenous women 45% less, so they're earning 55 cents on the dollar, and racialized women earn 40% less, so they get a grand total of 60 cents on the dollar. That's pre-pandemic. And we look at that based on how much money women have in their pockets on an annual basis. It measures their real poverty relative to men. And there are so many different drivers for this. So there's no, silver bullet for how you close this. We've talked about how unpaid care work is the work that makes everything else in the economy possible, but it's women who do that disproportionately, and it's women who are expected to do that when social infrastructure collapses, as we've seen during the pandemic, where women have taken on disproportionate amounts of caring for their family members who are ill, caring for children when schools and childcare systems are closed, trying to juggle all of that. We've seen, the things that add into that gap are the way we have a sex segregated labor market that devalues the work that women do. And so during the pandemic, all of those industries that are heavily female dominated, like tourism, travel, hotels, restaurants, retail, arts and culture, all of those slammed shut right at the beginning of the pandemic and are still mostly closed. So women have experienced a greater proportion of the economic loss during the pandemic, but at the same time, they're in all those high-risk jobs on the front lines where they've, whether it's nurses, PSWs, childcare, community and social services, et cetera, those the essential retail, grocery stores, where they have been getting sick in higher numbers. And many of those are those low paid crap jobs without protections, right? I mean crap jobs in the sense that they aren't given the respect and protections that would make them decent work. There's no access to full-time hours, there's no access to paid sick days. And so what you see is the women and the racialized communities with the most precarious work being sacrificed in the pandemic because they are not given the protections that would keep them safe. And the access to vaccines is similarly disparately available. So you see vaccine deserts in the sections of town that are populated by working class racialized essential workers, right? So the impact of all of this is that we're starting off with a labor market that is structured based on racial and gendered discrimination. And the way that the pandemic has rolled out has intensified that, and the response to the pandemic has not addressed the root causes of that structural inequality, which have made it even deeper. And it's costing lives. Bad policy is literally killing people.
Yeah, and you use the word sacrifice, I think, and there's all that like thank you essential workers as a blanket thing, but a thank you does not save a person's life, right?
An essential worker who does not have a living wage and decent conditions of work is not being treated in a way that's consistent with an economy based on care and that recognizes the importance of caring for each other in these times.
So those gaps in pay, or speaking of pay equity, that's just going to be much wilder once we look at those figures and statistics next year, right?
It'll be much worse because there's so many more women who've left the labor market altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And the terrifying thing is that as the structures of work get rebuilt in their absence, it's going to intensify the barriers to equality.
Okay, we're going to talk about those barriers more. But Robyn, I want to turn over to you and the Power Gap series, which is so impactful and already seeing some changes being made, which is amazing. It opens with the stunning fact that Ontario became the first province in Canada to pass equal pay legislation 70 years ago. 70. So if the Royal Commission is 50 years old, the Supreme Court is 70 years old, or this legislation is 70 years old. So that means the same work, same pay. And yet the gender pay gap has basically stalled out and barely shifted in 3 decades. How did your initial look at the gender pay gap, which is where your investigation began, the reporting, before it became the power gap, of course, how did it evolve ultimately and become the series that we read today, looking at the actual structures and how that influences power?
Yeah, so like you said, we started off this investigation very focused on wages. I think, Fay went through just the detailed breakdown of what the gender wage gap means. That's a phrase that can mean a million different things. I think the one that we hear about most commonly perhaps is that women make 87 cents for every dollar that a man makes, and that's the average of all hourly wages that a woman makes compared to all hourly wages that a man makes. It's not based on salary, it's not divided by type of work or sector, et cetera. And I find it a little frustrating when I hear that, only because I think it's, you have some types that kind of dismiss it, that go like, oh, that's because women work part-time. And then you're in a debate about like how people are socialized and how culturally that's not always a choice. And sometimes it is a choice, and that's perfectly fine. But my point is that it's kind of complicated. And I think the question that a lot of women have is they want to know if the guy sitting next to them, who's got the same education, the same responsibilities, the same job title, the same experience, is making the same amount of money. That's what we wanted to look at. The problem is that salaries are completely secret. And unlike, countries like in the United Kingdom, where every entity that has more than 250 employees has to publish some wage gap data, that isn't the case here. And so how are we going to look into this? And we ultimately landed on there is one segment of the workforce where salaries are not secret, and that is the public sector. So if you live in Ontario, you might know this as the Sunshine List, but most provinces have some sort of public sector salary disclosure. And this is people who work for public institutions. So that's core government, but also things like public or crown corporations. These are places that, sell booze, they do the lottery, sometimes they run your internet, transit, arts, these type of entities. Those salaries are not secret if you are over a certain threshold, and usually it's about $100,000. So we collected all of this data from across the country. And the cool thing about it is that it almost always has a name, a job title, and a salary. So you can actually look at that, go into one workforce and look at, okay, at a university, for example, professor, who's being paid more. We married the data with statistics on the gender probability of first names. So 90% of first names in Canada are associated with a specific gender 95% of the time. So very high degree of certainty. When those 10% of names that weren't certain, we did some fancy computer stuff to identify areas of volatility. And we then manually phoned, 1,000 people or researched them to ask them how they identified. We weren't able to break this down by other other measures such as race, because names are not a reliable indicator of that. But we did take all of the women in the top 1% of earners and all the women who were running some of these hundreds of entities, and again, phoned them and asked how they identified. So we started out looking at wages, but when we actually started crunching the numbers and getting into it, what we found was that wage wasn't, to me, the biggest story. Like, there was a wage gap. It was higher in the crown corporations, the public corporations, which more closely mirror the private sector. So that wasn't a big surprise. It was higher in the top of organizations, which again, wasn't surprising. But the bigger thing was just the lack of women. The women were dramatically outnumbered overall. So among six-figure earners, they were outnumbered at the very top on executive teams. And the real, I think, headline out of it was when we started breaking down individual workplaces by salary bands, so you can see the distribution at different levels on the corporate ladder. Women weren't making it through middle management. Like, their numbers were dropping off, and it wasn't a cliff. Like, that's not a great analogy, but it was really like a leaky pipeline. We did searches on job titles like manager, senior manager, director, general director, supervisor, these kind of associated with power positions, and women were just underrepresented everywhere. And they also tended to make less overall. So this is kind of the big takeaway, is that wages were super important, of course, because they're one indicator of power, but that's when we really kind of shifted the focus of the investigation to move beyond wages. This isn't just about salary or compensation. It's about the number of women in the pipeline and in decision-making roles. And I should add that of the women who do make it, they're almost entirely white. I think of the group that we manually phoned to ask, there was, I think, 1,100 women in that category, and 27 were racialized women. And that we couldn't break down that 27 by specific types of backgrounds. So obviously a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think like a big power of that piece was just to naming, like substantiating with data and naming it in a way, and also just kind of, you think about the decision makers at the top who are influencing the lives of people who are not making it, who are not in that pipeline, right? Because of many of these other barriers. So I want to talk about barriers and throw it out to all three of you. Because if we're going to talk about the state of women in work in 2021 with a pandemic, but also with these entrenched systemic barriers that have existed for a long time, I'm curious to know where you're sitting right now today. What would you think front and center in your mind as like the biggest barrier to not only advancing, obviously, but just to income security for women as well, and for, you know, the right to having a fulfilling life and contributing to your society, right? Who wants to jump in on that first? Then I'll jump at once.
I'll go.
Armine's been quiet for a little while since I went around the table.
Okay, no, I'll go, and it goes back to the hit tune I wrote last summer: no recovery without a she-covery, no she-covery without childcare.
You haven't put it to music yet? I'll put it
right?
on my guitar.
I don't know where the band is, right? Like that should be like parade music. However, it looks like the latest couple of prints of labor force data would suggest to some men primarily that the she session is over and we don't need the childcare. So why are we talking about childcare?
Just takes a few data points, right? Like,
right?
Oh, it's over. Yeah.
Yep. So everybody's ready for it to be over, and they're picking the she session to be over as the first way. Like, so I will be writing more about that. But just to go back to 2 points that have been made. Number one, more women have dropped out than men in the last year. They have dropped out because they cannot juggle childcare, homeschooling, and paid work. Now, the majority of women are not in that situation. In fact, the majority of people who can work from home are men. And only a minority of people can work from home. So it's only 41% of the workforce that can work from home. Most people have to go someplace to work. So remember that, all of you who are able to work from home are able to take off the lunch break, notwithstanding the rugrats in the background. If you are working from home, you are in the minority.
And you're privileged in a lot of ways.
A subset of these people that are able to say to their partner, honey, I just can't take it anymore, and I need to stop for a while to focus on care. Because even the people that do work from home aren't necessarily able to give up, to forfeit that money.
Mhm.
So the solution isn't just more money. It is actually getting into those pipelines that Robyn was talking about. And to the point that was being made by Fay about the wage gap will get worse. It will get worse for one reason, she said, which is that more women are dropping out. More women are not putting themselves ahead for promotion at this time when people who are working a lot more hours, but they can't work more hours. They're working less hours or dropping out. And so the one part that Fay mentioned, which I will just quibble with a bit, is that the pay gap will get bigger. It will probably get smaller in the next year or two because so many low paid women have been knocked out of the game. And if you like, we've already seen wage growth, which is a complete statistical chimera because it is based on the fact that so many people that have lost their jobs are low paid workers in retail, in restaurants, in tourism, and all these jobs that paid very low wages to begin with, they're not going back. So you knock them out and suddenly the wages look like they're rising. So it could very well be that the pay gap looks like it is shrinking in the next year or two, but that pay gaps, the earnings gap don't account for the people that have fallen out of the paid labor force.
Yeah, good
so
point.
Going right back to Heather's point, you cannot have stability and security if you are completely dependent on some other source of income. And you cannot be, to your point, Sarah, in a position of making decisions that can help others if you are not in the pipeline for decision making. So we do want to make sure more women are staying in the labor market, not because we fetishize paid labor, not because we don't recognize the power and importance of unpaid labor, but because we have to do better in the paid labor world. And there again, I'm going to go right back to what I said is I don't think we can move forward with it without putting care, which is over 12% of GDP and over 21% of jobs, at the heart of anything we are talking about in terms of a post-pandemic recovery and a way of building the middle class of the early 21st century, just like manufacturing did in the 50s to the 70s. You know, we can do this if we want, but it has to be a plan to do this.
Almost 20, that's almost a quarter, 21%, right? Like that's so
right.
The care
and that
economy.
Was pre-pandemic, and it's just growing because of population aging. It will continue to grow.
Exactly. Fay or Robyn? What's the biggest
I
barrier?
do want to. I want to jump in as well because I agree that the women's poverty is going to deepen significantly, and whether it's the waged portion or the economic dependence, women are going to be much poorer coming out of the pandemic than they were going in. And I think the biggest barriers to actually making movement on this are ideological. The fact that for 3 generations, governments have been choosing private profit over the well-being of workers, over economic security for people, is what is continuing to drive this gap. When you hear Armine talk about the care economy, both as the necessary precondition for everything else in the economy, but also a sector of work that is the largest and can be the driver of the economy, the fact that it's not chosen as a site of real investment in development has to do with the undervaluing of women's paid and unpaid work. It is ideological, as is the structural racism that allows those jobs to be done by racialized women in really precarious circumstances, and rather than increasing the quality of the jobs, we've made active choices through our governments to import even more precarious workers who are migrant workers, who are racialized women, who are doing it at even deeper sub-legal standards of work. So our problems aren't that we don't know how to fix it. It's that our governments are repeatedly making active choices to perpetuate it. And until there's that shift, then we're going to keep having these conversations. And 50 years from now, we're still going to be asking for childcare.
Well, speaking of sublegal, I'm thinking about all the outbreaks for amongst migrant workers, right, through the pandemic as well, never mind the communities.
Where they
essential
were
workers
blamed
and-
for it, right? Where they were blamed for carpooling, for living in, you know, housing that had multiple families. Well, of course you're going to if you are paid wages that don't allow you to have anything else, right?
Yeah,
And
you
if
can't
you're
afford to go
housed
live
in,
on your own.
and where laws actually require you to live in congregate housing. So there's that, like all of the narratives around who is to blame for the harm and the refusal to actually look at the structural reasons that the harm is occurring to the people who are experiencing it are the problems in when we look at what is the policy making going to look like. Is it going to entrench those same dynamics, or is there actually a will to transform that?
Yeah, it's like, it's way easier to blame and point a finger than it is to structurally dismantle everything, despite the opportunity of now. Robyn, what do you see as a barrier?
Yeah, I think first off, there is no one barrier. There is like a minefield of barriers, to mix metaphors here. But I can build off of something that Fay was talking about, that the barriers are ultimately ideological, which I agree with. I think, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say pretty much everyone listening to this is a woman, and probably you've all are very familiar with the challenge that women face, that women are expected to adhere to qualities that are associated with, feminine qualities, like I'm sympathetic, I'm agreeable, that leadership is associated with things like confidence, which happens to be associated with male traits, and that women may exhibit traits that are synonymous with leadership, they're viewed negatively. That research shows women who are successful are viewed more negatively, that women's income takes a 20% hit after having children, where fathers face no such consequence. Like you are all familiar with these research points, I'm sure. I think for me, what I didn't realize until I started doing this work was that I always assumed that if you were pregnant and you, told your employer, I'm pregnant, and they fired you, that wasn't allowed and you could do something about it. And
That's all the time, Robyn.
Still one of the most common experiences of discrimination.
It was truly mind-blowing to me how many women I've interviewed in the last 2 years who were fired after telling their employer that they were pregnant.
It doesn't happen like as a firing. It's like, oh, there's some other reason, right? Like,
one was actually told who, I'm going to fire you, and I know you can't do anything about it. So you can take this severance, or you can whatever. And this is where I get to my next point. You mentioned off the top that, equal pay legislation is 70 years old. That's true. There's been legislation that has made it illegal to let gender influence promotions or hirings or firing, decades old legislation. It has been on the books both through government and through court precedent. It's been illegal to fire a woman for becoming pregnant. These laws are decades and decades old. We don't need any more laws. They're not being enforced. If you encounter gender discrimination in the workforce, there's very little you can do about it. And that's where you kind of don't think about it until who do you call? You want to tell your boss? Well, they're probably part of it. You want to go to HR? HR is not a good place. Sorry if there's any HR people listening right now. You probably know this too, but HR is almost always not your friend. You can go to, if you're fired, you can sue in a regular courtroom and attach gender discrimination or racial discrimination on as an aggravating factor. You can go to the Human Rights Tribunal, which is the body that was set up to deal with discrimination courses or cases. Fay, you can interrupt me anytime if I'm misstating this. I'm always
you are, and
when I'm talking to lawyers,
5% of all discrimination calls into the Human Rights Legal Support Center are about pregnancy-related firing. 5%, but also the tribunal is being sabotaged because they're not appointing adjudicators, so they literally can't hold hearings. They're and that's a whole other issue.
It's so where do you go? You basically have to go to the Human Rights Tribunal system. Okay, the Human Rights Tribunal system is being chronically, and in some cases purposefully defunded and not staffed, right? So this is creating a situation where average wait times is something between 2 and 4 years. Everywhere across the country. I've encountered cases that went 10 years. I've spoken with dozens and dozens of lawyers who tell me that a woman is fired when she's pregnant, she files a human rights tribunal complaint. By the time it gets to a hearing, the kid is in school. So practically speaking, oh, and by the way, if you win, which is hard because it's hard to prove gender discrimination, because there's, and I'm quoting Fay here, so it feels awkward, she's on the call, but like that you take 2 employees here, and it's always really easy to, not easy, but like you can always explain why one person is making more than another person. It's when you back up and see like, why is it that all these people who are very similar are making more than these types of people? But so it's very hard to win. If you do win, your damages are almost always between like $5,000 and $20,000, and the loser doesn't pay legal costs. So if you've hired a lawyer, you have to pay for your lawyer out of that. All of this means women are not doing this. They're not going to the human rights tribunal system. They're doing 2 things. They're either, well, 3 things, I guess. They're either biting their lip and pushing through. They're switching jobs, going somewhere else. Or if what often happens too is they do complain internally, there's some sort of investigation or yada yada, and oh, the relationship is broken down, we think it's time you leave, here's some severance. Oh, and by the way, if you take this money, we're going to need you to sign this confidentiality clause or this non-disparagement agreement. You can never talk about what happened to you. You can't tell your coworkers, you can't tell people who might come to work here. And now we don't have to fix it because no one knows about it. And lawyer after lawyer after lawyer told me it is actually it's a cost of doing business. It is cheaper to continue the discrimination than to actually address these issues. So when we talk about barriers, it's like there's all this cultural, sociological, socialization barriers. The laws that are supposed to enforce them are almost impossible to get enforced. So this is where it's like, how do you possibly fix this?
Well, we're still going to talk about that, of course, though. And I wanted to get into the legislation. We're going to have another webinar on the legislation specifically, because I mean, there's so many parallels as well to like sexual harassment cases as well. But I want to turn it back over to to Armine about, and Fay as well too, a little bit more, and Robyn, of course, let's talk about this. But like, back to sort of the care economy piece and the plans forward and the ways forward on that, and the social infrastructure aspect more specifically, because you'd already talked about this, Armine, and I saw this myself analyzing the Ontario budget. We're in a recession, of course, as we've identified, and there's still lots more money for infrastructure, for shovels in the ground, building roads, construction, and I did not see much, if of anything, in the way of investment in childcare, for example, provincially. And I mean, I'm really excited to see what happens on Monday. But can we just talk about that social infrastructure piece a little bit more, and what that could fundamentally look like, and how that could actually potentially really help us turn a new chapter, open a new chapter in the economy, and help women out of the situation that we're all in? I mean,
well, if we're talking about a new chapter, then we may be talking about a new lexicon. So partly what Robyn's been doing is talking about how our old language is not working. And the pandemic has helped us lift the hood on what is essential in an essential economy. So we are developing a new language. In fact, I think tomorrow, but if not tomorrow, then on Friday, along with 5 other co-writers and 50 other signatories, original signatories, we're launching a campaign called the Care Economy. And we are sending our message, our statement of principles, to all federal members of parliament, including the opposition, because you know when this budget comes out on Monday, that some people are going to say, oh, we spent too much. And we're going to say, fine, if you think we're spending too much and you think we should be spending differently or less, show us how you embed these principles that we think are, that at least our group and more people we hope will sign on. And I will share this with you. Maybe you can share this with your audience. We're hoping everybody sends this note to their own elected representative, and to anybody that, if we trigger another federal election, the next time Ontario or BC goes to the polls, that we make it not only a budget about the care economy, but an election about the care economy. Is how do you take what the pandemic has revealed, about the systemic ways in which we call people essential, but we treat them as essentially disposable, particularly if they are people of color, particularly if they are recent immigrants or migrant workers, as Fay says, that we open the taps on people that are cheap to do the work that we need done, that we don't want to pay for. And then we wonder why care is so awful. So like putting a premium on quality, making sure that every job is, I mean, I'm using conservative phraseology here. Every job can be a good job. Let's make every job a good job. A job is a good thing. Make sure every job is a good job so that we're not creating substandard work and then saying, why are you unhappy that you're doing this thing? Because we need you and you need a job.
Well, and
So
it's that
I
you should
think
be grateful to have a job kind of thing too, right?
Exactly. So I think there is a way to change the lexicon. We will not turn on a dime, but I think starting now and in this conversation, we can start talking about how we need to normalize people stepping away from their paid work to provide paid care, unpaid care. So some of the things that Robyn was talking about, a 20% cut for women once they've had a kid, which doesn't occur, by the way, in lifetime earnings for women who choose not to have a child. It's the mommy factor that creates this decline. But if men who have children acted the same as women, everybody that had a kid would have to step away periodically. It's this idea that we are fetishizing paid work and our devotion. Let me just make very clear that when we fetishize paid work, and we say that some people have to step away from paid work to deal with unpaid care needs of people who are too young, too old, or too sick to work, that we are saying your devotion should be first and foremost to your employer in life.
To the almighty dollar.
We
right?
know
Capitalism.
that, well, at least the almighty employer, you know, which may even be a non-profit enterprise like the Y, you know, like it. What we are saying is your primary devotion should not be to your employer, and that we recognize that people need to step in and out of the paid labor force, whether they are male or female or some other identification, to be able to do the things that you need to be human. And we need to normalize that. And that will require a change in the way we view the role of the economy, the way we view the role of paid work, the way we view the role of unpaid care, and how we value all of these various things. So there's a recalibration of value that is coming up, but we need a language to help us navigate this, because to Fay's point, for 40 years or more, we have been bowing at a different type of altar of devotion, which has been more market, less government. You know, basically, I just want to raise one other thing. One of the reasons why we did not get childcare in the last 50 years is an ideology that we can all slip into too easily, which is the ideology of choice. Pro-lifers talk about choice, so do feminists. Choice is a slippery concept. And choice is when you choose to have a child, good for you. You want a child? That's your choice. You don't want a child? That's your choice. Once you have a child, you want to work? That's your choice. If you need childcare while you work, that's also your choice. We don't provide that publicly because that's a personal, private choice. Well, the pandemic has lifted the hood on showing us, to your point about social infrastructure, how we are literally leaving money on the table by not tackling this as a collective good, as a public good. And if we only pursue this as individual options, so I'll give you more money in your pocket, you go buy that childcare. Yeah. Well, all you have done is flooded the market with more money. You have not changed the market. Right. We need to get away from a market-driven system, which has delivered nothing but market failure. We have childcare, we have all this money in the system, and childcare deserts. The people that most need the care don't have the care. We can do better than markets, but we have to think about it differently. So I hope we can do that.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what like Robyn's work too, on just having the data and having the public discussion around it. Fay, what were you going to say in response to this?
I completely agree with Armine. I'm going to say that I'm one of the signatories to that letter. Get out there, sign it, circulate it. Absolutely. And, you know, if the fight for paid sick days doesn't completely encapsulate what Armine was saying about an economy that is based on inhumanity. Nothing else does. You know, the fact that most workers don't have paid sick days, and the more precarious the worker, the less likely they are to have them, is based on an ideology that any time you're not at work is theft from your employer. And that it's
and the guilt that a lot of
it's
us women
your
feel on this too.
responsibility to never get sick, right? Like to always be available. And that's just madness. That has nothing to do with what human beings are in the real world. And so we do need a shift, and we need different language to hold governments to account. The economy, with all apologies to economists, is a fiction in the sense that it is what we decide to create, and it serves the ends that we decide that it should serve. So an economy that's driven by profit for the few results in the inhumanity that we're seeing, and entrenches all those structural discriminations. But an economy that's based on an ethic of care and on an ethic of preserving the humanity of human beings and living beings in our world, not just humans, but non-human beings as well, serves a different end that will actually improve our quality of life. And unless we ask the question of every policy initiative, who does this serve? Who benefits from this? Does this make life better? Does it increase care? Then we're just going to keep going round in this circle. And so the onus is also on all of us who want a better world to hold decision makers to account and call them out when they're promoting a world that's not based on the reality of human life and the well-being of all beings.
Yeah, like shifting it even just from, if we're speaking these gender silos or spectrums, even it's a human thing, right? It's just a humanity thing.
Like we've got the pandemic going on, but the planet's burning, and if we don't have a planet, then all the rest of it is kind of
priorities, right? I mean, Robyn, do you have anything else to add to that, or just looking ahead to the?
No, Armine and Fay have spoken so beautifully about the dramatic need to acknowledge unpaid care work, to completely shift our understanding of where our priorities should be about the need for a childcare program. Like the number one thing at the end of every interview, I always ask people, like, if you could wave a magic wand and fix something overnight, like daycare, childcare program came up over and over again. Today, I dropped my girls off. They go to the YMCA, and I can't tell you how upsetting it was because they are doing vaccinations at this YMCA. And there's a line of people being vaccinated, and none of our childcare workers could get vaccinated. And it's just so awful. And you really realize just like how vital they are to your life.
Oh, Robyn, I'm feeling you hard. I'm feeling you.
I think if I can just end on, I said earlier, like, I don't even know what you do at this point, because it's when you can't even complain about the challenges that you're facing. I think at this point, we are still at the part of, we don't even know how deep the problem is, because this country is so lacking in data and lacking in any information. And like by focusing on the wage gap, again, it's super important, but you miss the fact that like the, even within its specific institutions, what's the representation, right? Like the gap, we found like, for example, in our data set, we found on average, the women of color in the 1% made more than the white women on average. But there were so few of them that it's because like the two that are running universities or something were driving up the average. Like it's really important to look at this by all sorts of metrics. So I think, now what I would hope for. Like, I would love something like what they have in the UK, where they have to publish representation data, wage gap data, gender wage gap data, racialized staff data.
Oh, can I just interrupt, because we
Like that.
actually, the Equal Pay Coalition lobbied for that and got that legislation.
That
And
is
one
a-
of the first things that the Ford government did was to shut it down. On May 15th of this year, we would have been receiving the first round of transparency reports that would have given you all of that data, along with protections for workers sharing their data or looking for data that would help them enforce their rights. But that was a deliberate choice to hide that information, even though employers can provide it like that. It's
and
like,
that's the kind of thing that you
yeah.
need. And things like, if I sign a settlement agreement and I give someone a severance and they've made a complaint of gender discrimination and it just goes away, there should be some amount of transparency. There are lots of good reasons that you're not going to publish details of a settlement agreement with someone, but especially a public employer that's being paid for with tax dollars should have to say, we received this many complaints of discrimination on these accounts, because there are people that move between institutions, that get fired from one institution, apply. I know of cases where they've applied at another, gotten the job, the place calls for a reference, they can't say anything. It's like, there's just transparency is kind of like step one. Sorry for becoming a little emotional. It's been a—
No, you know what? Hey, we laughed, we cried, we're
Yeah.
despairing in all kinds of directions. So sorry, I actually just quickly want to pivot it to Armine before, and then open it to questions. We want to make sure we have these questions. Armine, can you since you're sitting here with us, what's going on at that table? What's going to happen in the budget? Give us a little peek behind the curtain. Give us a little preview, very quickly.
All I can tell you is that I've been on many advisory groups at the municipal, provincial, and federal level, and I've never been in a process like this where the ministers are present and other ministers are invited in to hear what the group is saying. So it is an unusual process. It is unclear how it will influence anything, as is rightly the case, because we are not making the ultimate decisions. We are just feeding in information. And we have a term of a year. So we were supposed to be helping design something for the budget, though obviously we weren't doing any writing of the budget because, when we were appointed, which was International Women's Day, March the 8th, it was probably already written. So yeah, sure, the ink hadn't dried, and sure, maybe they might have changed, some marketing or language or something around that because of what we said. They might have even added one or two small details based on the conversations. But really, I think the point was to do two things: to have a sniff test of this group, this remarkable group of people, on what was in our minds. As Robyn said, you ask people, wave a magic wand, what do you want? To hear what the answer to that was from this group is really an important sniff test to see if they're on the right page. Of course, they didn't divulge where they were already heading. And to be absolutely brutally honest, I think we were there post-budget to help them devise their platform. I think that's the only reason why we're there.
Politics, right?
But, I just want to point out that any elected official can reach out. And I have also spoken to the new finance minister in Ontario, who's not like most of the other members of caucus, either because he's a real smooth operator or because he's actually different. I don't know which it is, but like any elected official can reach out and create their own task force that either puts care at the center or asks women what they want. I mean, we have been asking women what they want for a very long time, and we know what we want. So just ask us and then do something about it. Don't just ask us.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, again, there's a whole series of panels that we need to do on these subjects. So thank you for generously scratching the surface and going slightly deeper as we did here today. And we have about just shy of 15 minutes left. So I did just want to invite anybody who does have a question, a participant, to please raise your hand or drop the question that you have into the Q&A bar, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. I did notice one question in the chat, so I'm just going to ask that one of the group here. So The question is, how do society's increasingly intensive mainstream parenting practices impact working mothers' careers? And so they elaborated, they said, for example, studies show working moms spend more time on parenting today than stay-at-home mothers did in the 50s. I don't know, does anyone have any thoughts on that? That's certainly an unpaid care work job question, and it circulates around ideology in a sense, right? You know, like how we approach these things.
One thing on this really quickly, Sarah, you probably also have some thoughts, but there is an expectation that women will parent in a certain way, and there is pressure, and women are viewed much more negatively if they are not seen as upholding a standard that is deemed acceptable. So I think that you know, I sometimes hear the like, oh, like, you know, back in my, don't talk to your mother sometimes, or at least my mother. Like, you know, we would just leave you guys if you went to practice. Anyway, there is an expectation that, and that again, there's real research that bears this out, that employers are more likely to view, if you're a woman and not seen as upholding your end of the bargain with your children, because it is a complete choice that's yours to make if you choose to have children and you know the rules, you're viewed more negatively in your workplace. So whereas men are viewed positively, like, oh, look, they've had children, that's more stable for them. So I think that is, again, a big problem that we have. And I can also say, this isn't just about men too. Like, I took partial mat leave, so I didn't take a full 12 months with either of my girls. My husband and I split it. And I did get quite a bit of sass from some people that I know, and they were all women that kind of, they're like, we are all kind of holding on to the status quo expectations. So I think that's part of the solution too, is just interrogating our own views and this, how we have been socialized, and the things that we're holding on to as part of this.
I'd like to weigh in very briefly, which is to say that fertility rates around the world have been falling for decades. When you have less of something, its value goes up. So there has been, generationally speaking, far more investment in the human capital of the fewer number of kids. And to the point that richer bitches can actually invest more in their kids than working class women who have to work longer hours. This perpetuates this whole kind of divide that Fay was talking about before, about what kind of human capital investments can be made in our kids. So parenting is categorically different, because children are viewed as an asset in a very different way than they were half a century ago, where they were really, you know, they were the way that you survived past working age.
They were like farm hands, right? Like we
are looking at no change in that, because fertility rates continue to drop. And so long as fertility rates continue to drop, parents will parent differently, and particularly by socioeconomic strata.
And I think it's also ideologically connected in with the neoliberalism that starts socializing people into being, feeling a sense of scarcity around economic security, and needing to get into this ridiculous escalating credentialism that starts like in the sandbox in the playground, and infects children all the way through elementary and secondary school, never mind beyond that. It's and that is, driving not just mental health concerns for women who are being beaten up for not being super moms, but also for children who are being socialized into fear of failure, fear of poverty.
Yeah, scarcity mindset is
artificial scarcity.
Yes. I had a quick, actually, with you, Fay. Well, we're still with you. We have, anyone obviously, but legislation of employment equity regimes. We had sort of a question about building back better and the sort of role of what an employment equity, like, is there a role for employment equity legislation as we sort of identify and peel back the layers on a lot of these systemic issues, certainly racism and sexism as well?
I think that we need a much deeper transformation of what's going on, to the extent, and that's not to discount the value of employment equity legislation. It is about ensuring that there is greater diversity in workplaces, but like having different diversity will certainly spread available wealth, but it doesn't necessarily change the structures of how businesses are operated or how the economy is operated. And, so while it's one tool, I think that we need to be thinking about much more radical transformation. This, when we think about what is, if you just, for example, getting women into higher positions in corporations isn't necessarily a feminist goal if it's just about equal opportunity oppression, right? Like,
And
are
who
they
says
going
that
to
they're
take on
feminists,
those?
right?
I
Like,
know.
who
Well, so
says that
if the
they're
fact that someone is going to be in a position implementing the same oppressive system doesn't actually change it into the transformational ethic of care and ethic of social solidarity that we're talking about. So I think that this is not a time to be thinking about small solutions. This is a time to really get to the root of it and ask for the whole thing.
we need the whole thing. Are there any other questions? Anyone want to put their hand up? We can have you verbally ask, or if there are any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. We're a quiet group today, but I think at least from my perspective, I think we just covered so much amazing ground and a lot of questions that I came to the table with. I know I wrote the questions, but there were so many other ones that sort of arose and were answered through the course of the conversation, as happens. So I think if we don't have any other questions popping up, I really just want to, again, say how grateful I am to have this team. It's sort of like Voltron, like, this power team of let's connect and just solve all the problems of the world. Obviously, we've identified very many that we will have to have deeper conversations about later. But maybe just before we go, are there any thoughts on the federal budget, wish list, magic wand, parting thoughts before we say goodbye?
I mean, I think it's really challenging with addressing this issue. The federal government is, I don't want to say it's limited because they can do a lot. They're the federal government. But like, as Fay mentioned, like, we need the provinces, like, so much of this stuff is dealt with at the provincial level. And we saw in Ontario, like, there was so many good things in that piece of legislation that is just kind of collecting dust right now. And that it's ultimately up to provincial governments. And I think so the federal government can certainly lead by example, though. Childcare is like, that's their area that needs to get dealt with. And I think it's Armine. I'm sure this is you who talks to me about, when we were talking about this before, that's like that this is sometimes deemed as a political loser because you only have to deal with this issue of like childcare for a couple of years and that people are going to care about it after. And that is a real barrier, I think, if you're thinking of like cold, callous politics of politicians going, well, this group of people might vote for it. And it's like, but it's going to be a huge expense that will pay dividends on the other side. There's lots of research that shows that, but can we make people care about something that only a small segment of the population is going to deal with it, or is going to reap that benefit, and just shifting the conversation to be like, it's not just a small portion. And frankly, like, do I want my daughters dealing with this when if they just choose to have children down the road? Because I can't tell you how many women I interviewed in the last couple of years who are saying like, I cannot believe I am still talking about these issues. We were told in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s that this would be corrected by now. And here we are, my daughter's going off to university and this is where it's at. So childcare. Let's
also see grandparents. I've heard the point made that like grandparents are going to really be pushing for this after the year that
they're like, I don't want to deal with these kids. I'm retired. We've been locked up for a year.
I actually do have a couple more questions that popped in last minute. So maybe this is a good one for Armine. If universal childcare takes longer to build, do you think we'll lose public and cross-sectoral momentum for it? I feel like this is kind of sort of just been spoken to, but what do you think, Armine?
I think we are just starting to see the momentum build for it. I think we're just starting to see every political party feeling like they have to have an answer to this, because it is not just the short run. It isn't just the today, it's the tomorrow. We are entering 3 decades of population aging. We saw it in the months coming up to the pandemic, where month after month on both sides of the border in Canada and US, we saw record low unemployment rates, levels we haven't seen in 40 or 50 years. That, ladies and gentlemen, is population aging. More people exiting the labor market than coming into it, so unemployment rates fall. This is an historic opportunity for us to maximize everybody's potential, to make sure every child that enters school is learning ready and is learning supported as they go through school. That will maximize their learning potential and will maximize their earning potential for decades to come. We will reap what we sow, whether we do it or not. This is starting to penetrate through the very thick skulls of business leaders who recognize that they need better trained people and more learned, like that's what they've always wanted, right? We want more more human capital in the people that come to the job, because the only other option here with a declining fertility rate is more immigration, and that creates its own cascade of problems. So we need to maximize the potential of the shrinking working force that is going to be lifting up the people too old, too young, and too sick to work. So we're going to see a dependency ratio we haven't seen since the boomers were first born.
Wow.
And so we need to make sure we're maximizing their ability to contribute, which means that all governments will be spending less on the so-called losers and getting more revenues if they are doing better in the economy. People from across the political spectrum are waking up to this. So I don't think we are going to lose momentum. And I think if we start this care economy focus, that we change the lexicon, we change the frame. Look, we've gone through the looking glass. Yeah. We are in levels of deficit that is so crazy now that it is clear that we can create any kind of a world we want, so long as we know what kind of a world we want to create. So our job as feminists, as thinkers about the future, should be what kind of a world are we trying to create that, to Fay's point, increases the humanity of what we humans bring to the table. And what we bring to the table is not just money. We bring far more than money to the table. Good. So let us build on that asset going forward. I honestly think we are in a transitional moment, that what was the norm for the last 40 years is failing at every level. You know, more market, less government has failed at every possible level. And the pandemic and climate change are just forcing us to consider, if markets aren't like the god before which we all bow down to make sure that they are functioning positively, then what is the system that we have to make sure works? And that puts a whole new conversation about what are our governments for and who are they for? Yeah. That is the moment we are walking into. It's brand new. Let's have a good ride.
First G session of the ever. Okay, I'm mindful of our time. We actually are a minute over, and I'm really glad that this webinar didn't like spontaneously combust at the 1:15 mark. Cut poor Armine off. Does anyone have like 2 more minutes for one more question? Because they kind of came in late, and then we'll end it. Because people are still here. Is that okay? One kind of interesting question is sort of around men. And I mean, you talked about business leaders, it's just starting to get through the thick skull, but how do we get more men engaged in this recovery and just in engaging on a lot of these systemic issues, especially because I'm commenting here myself, it can often be kind of siloed, right? This is a woman's problem.
I think that where we really have to build is to build from the bottom. And when you look at who is at the bottom, who has the worst jobs, it is women, it is racialized women, it is racialized men. And I think looking at the structures that, when you have an intersection of gender and race, there is a large swath of our society that is excluded from rights. And I include in that all the migrant workers and undocumented workers who are in the sub-basement of sub-legal standards of work. We're expecting an announcement with respect to immigration today. I don't know what it will entail yet. But if it isn't something that provides status for all and security and regularization for people at the bottom, then that's not the transformation we want, and we need to call it out. But I think that we have to understand that we are living in a world in which there are very rigid binary gendered codes that penalize the feminine. And a world without that actually helps all of us. I think that the economic structures that create precarious, unsustainable work for men and women, and particularly racialized workers, are the place to start building up.
Yeah, wonderful. Good.
Can I double down on that a little bit?
Yeah.
When we want to link arms with men, and so many men are the men on top, I just want to point out that Fay is absolutely right. The new orthodoxy has to be building everything up from the bottom up, because trickle down did not work. So we want men to join us in that effort. If they think that, I'm happy to have all sorts of corporate executives sign on. I would love the Business Council of Canada to sign on to the care economy. Yeah. I'm very grateful to the men that have signed on, that are in positions of power, but they will not make or break this movement. We will make it. And we will break all of the previous rules by building from the bottom up.
Yeah. Yeah. And we need those partners at the law firms, hey, Robyn, that are allowing the transparency as well and are facilitating it. Yeah, exactly. Okay,
I'm going to let that, but I feel like we're over. So
we are over. So I was just
Globe and Mail, Power Gap, law firms, you'll get caught up. It'll be fine.
Yes, everyone go look up Robyn's name on the Globe and Mail site. But so in closing, then, thank you, Armine, Fay, Robyn, for taking time out to be with us, and also to everyone who attended and stuck around. I mean, we're trickling out now, but that's because we're over time, but we had really nice attendance, and thank you. Lots of ways to stay in touch with YWCA Toronto. Follow us on social media at YWCA Toronto. I believe you can follow all of these brilliant minds here on this panel at their name, at Armine Yalnizyan, at Fay Faraday, at Robyn Doolittle on social media as well. And please, there's lots of great dispatches that everybody is putting out there all the time. Yes, we're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have a Feminist Edge monthly newsletter you could sign up for. Check out our blog. If you're interested in donating to support our work to serve and advocate for women and gender diverse people across the city, we'd of course welcome that too. So thanks so much to everyone. Please have a great rest of your day and stay safe out there. Take care.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.